Hey everyone, Pastor George here with chapter 10 of The Reason for God today in our Theolog. And today we're talking about sin, or Tim Keller wants to talk about sin anyway, right? So sin is one of the big words that we often hear kind of thrown around. And for people who aren't familiar with Christianity, and even Christians themselves may have a misunderstanding of what sin actually is or what it's trying to communicate, right? So when we think of sin, we think of we're given a list of rules, and when you break those rules, you commit a sin, right? And that is true on one level, right? So there's the 10 Commandments, and if you're going to break one of the 10 Commandments, that's a sin. But we usually, especially as like pastors and theologians and philosophers, try to look deeper beyond just the rules and try to figure out what their purpose was and what the Bible was actually trying to communicate when it talks about these things. And I'm going to read something from Tim Keller, and then I'm just going to respond to it, because I know I usually save him for the end, but I think I'd like to have him towards the beginning today, because I think it'll be more fruitful. So I'm just going to read this real quick, so I'll put it up on the screen. So Tim Keller writes, "So according to the Bible, the primary way to define sin is not just the doing of bad things, but the making of good things into ultimate things. It is seeking to establish a sense of self by making something else more central to your significance, purpose, and happiness than your relationship to God." I think that's really well stated. And the reason, what he uses as a basis for this, and what many people use, is if we look at the 10 Commandments, right, what's number one? If you know your 10 Commandments, you know that is, I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, right? And the second one is about idols, building idols, and it kind of goes down the list. When we sin, when we act in a way that displeases God or breaks one of those rules, it's not that we're breaking this arbitrary set of rules, right? It's not like this was set up and we're casting it aside. You know, God says not to steal, and so when we steal, you know, we're breaking those rules. But in actuality, what all these kind of things tie back to is, what do we value the most in our lives? So, for instance, if we're talking about talking about adultery, right? The statute against adultery in the Bible. When we commit adultery, what are we doing, right? Well, we're putting our own happiness, our own pride, our own joy, our own satisfaction above those of our neighbors, right? Namely, the person who you're committing adultery against, right? So your wife or your husband, and also the person on the other ends, if they happen to be married or in a relationship with someone else, you're ruining that, right? So there's a human thing, but you're also, what you're doing in that moment is you're saying, well, God doesn't, God says that this is bad. I think I know a little bit more than God does about what's good and what's bad, so I'm going to engage in this, right? And that's kind of what's at the base act of sin. And the reason this has to tie in with all these things about whether or not we know God exists is because if you remember yesterday, we talked about morality, right? And how do we determine what's good and evil? And Tim Keller makes a compelling case. I think that we understand at some level that things are supposed to be good and evil, right? We have a conscience, so we understand that things can be disordered. And the Christian explanation that he's giving for this is sin, right? Sin entered the world through, in our narrative, right, through original sin of eating the fruit in the garden, right? But even more so, it carries down through the centuries and taints every single generation. And the only way that we can get rid of that in the Christian world originally was to pay some sort of price, right? To try and set things right. Well, when we have a society that's gone off kilter so much, when we have our souls that have gone off kilter so much, we can't really set it right besides making some sort of ultimate sacrifice, which in the Christian view is the sacrifice that God makes himself with Jesus on the cross, right? So what the reason today is important is because we're trying to frame Christian response to the evil, to the brokenness in the world, right? So we're trying to figure out what's wrong with the world, because if we can figure out what's wrong with the world, then we can fix it, or we can tell people how it's fixed or how it was fixed. So that's what we're talking about today. If you have any questions, always reach out to me. Plenty of you do, so keep them coming. I will see you tomorrow with our next chapter, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. See you then.